I didn't argue. I didn't make a scene. I just stood there in the parking lot of the Riverside Inn, holding my overnight bag, reading that text from my daughter a second time to make sure I understood it correctly. Dad, I cancelled your room. The inn is fully booked for the rehearsal dinner guests. You can sit in the lobby if you want to come, but honestly, it might be easier if you just drove home. 63 years on this earth. 41 of them spent building a structural engineering firm from a single drafting table in my garage in Columbus. I had inspected bridges across 6 states. I had shaken hands with mayors and senators. I had buried my wife of 34 years without falling apart, because I knew she wouldn't have wanted that. And my daughter, my only child, had just told me to sleep in the lobby at her rehearsal dinner weekend like I was a distant acquaintance who had shown up uninvited. I put my phone in my shirt pocket. I looked at the inn. It was a nice place, actually. Colonial style, white columns, the kind of property that photographs well for wedding websites. My daughter had chosen it because her fiancé's family had ties to the venue. His mother had apparently been a regular guest for years. I had paid for half the wedding. I stood there for probably 2 full minutes, which is a long time to stand still in a parking lot. An older couple walked past me toward the entrance, and the woman smiled at me the way people smile at someone they're not sure is okay. I smiled back and nodded, because that's what you do. Then I walked back to my car, set my bag in a trunk, and drove 3 miles down the road to the Harrington Grand. The Harrington Grand was the kind of hotel that had a doorman in a hat and a lobby that smelled like cut flowers and leather. I had driven past it on my way in and thought it looked expensive in the particular way that makes you feel slightly better about the world just by looking at it. The front desk associate was a young man named Marco, according to his name tag, and he had the calm professionalism of someone who had been trained to treat every guest like the only one who mattered. I asked him what was available for the weekend. He tapped a few things and told me the standard rooms were sold out for the weekend due to a regional conference. He paused the way people pause before they say something that costs money. We do have the presidential suite available, sir. It's our finest accommodation. 2 bedrooms, a private dining area, a terrace overlooking the river. It runs $1,400 a night. I thought about the text message in my shirt pocket. I'll take it for 2 nights, I said. And is the restaurant downstairs open for breakfast tomorrow? Yes, sir, 7 to 11. Reserve me a table for 1 at 8. I unpacked my bag in a room that had floor-to-ceiling windows facing the Scioto River and a bathroom with heated floors and a soaking tub I would absolutely never use. I ordered room service, the ribeye because I hadn't eaten since noon, and I sat at the desk by the window and looked at the city lights reflecting off the water. I thought about my daughter. Her name is Cassandra, but she's gone by Cassie since she was 4 years old and announced at the dinner table that Cassandra was a mouthful and she preferred something shorter. Her mother and I had laughed until we cried. She had always been like that, decisive, sharp, a little theatrical, utterly sure of herself. I had loved all of it. I had loved all of it right up until the day she brought home the man she was marrying. His name is Preston, and I want to be careful here, because this is not a story about disliking your daughter's husband for vague or sentimental reasons. I didn't dislike Preston because he was new, or because he wasn't what I'd imagined, or because no man is ever good enough for your daughter. I disliked Preston because within 6 months of meeting him, I had begun to notice things that didn't add up, and I had spent 41 years in a profession where things that don't add up eventually fall down. The first thing I noticed was small. Preston had mentioned at a Sunday dinner that he worked in private equity. He said it the way people say things they want to sound impressive, leaning back, letting the phrase, "do the work." When I asked him a few questions, nothing aggressive, just the kind of questions I'd ask anyone at a dinner table, his answers had the shape of knowledge without the substance. He knew the vocabulary. He didn't know the architecture underneath it. I didn't say anything. Cassie was happy. He was attentive to her. I filed it away. The second thing was harder to ignore. Cassie mentioned about 4 months before the wedding that Preston had asked her to put her condo in both their names before the ceremony. She said it like it was a romantic gesture. He wants us to already be building something together, Dad. And I had nodded and said that was something she should probably talk to a lawyer about before doing. She had looked at me the way she'd been looking at me since she started spending most of her time in Preston's world, which was the look that said she thought I was being difficult. She transferred the condo into joint tenancy 2 weeks later without talking to a lawyer. I called my own attorney the next morning, an old colleague named Harland who had done estate work for my firm for 15 years. I told him what I'd observed and asked him to do some quiet research on Preston's background, professional history, financial history, any litigation. I told him to take his time and be thorough. Harland called me back 3 weeks later. He talked for 40 minutes. I took notes on a legal pad and filled nearly 4 pages. Preston had not worked at any registered private equity firm in Ohio or any adjacent state. He had been named in a civil suit in 2019 in Indiana, a breach of contract case involving a real estate investment that had dissolved, taking several investors' money with it. The case had settled out of court. There was a second complaint filed in 2021 in Kentucky, similar pattern, also settled. His name appeared in a limited liability company that had been administratively dissolved by the Ohio Secretary of State for failure to file the required annual reports. The company's listed business address was a UPS store in Dublin. I put down my pen. I thought about my daughter's condo. I thought about the way she'd looked at me when I suggested she talk to a lawyer. I thought about the wedding, which was now 11 days away, at which point Preston would become her legal husband, and whatever came next would come for both of them. And I made a decision. I did not call Cassie that night. I had tried, twice in the previous month, to raise my concerns gently, and both times she had shut down the conversation and called Preston to tell him her father was being impossible. I had heard his voice in the background once, calm and reasonable, saying something I couldn't make out, but that had the cadence of a man who was very good at reframing other people's concerns as the other person's problem. I needed something she couldn't dismiss. I needed something concrete enough that even Preston couldn't smooth it away. I called Harland back and told him what I needed. Then I called a private investigator I had worked with once before, during a dispute with a subcontractor who had been billing my firm for materials that were never delivered. His name is Wallace, and he is methodical and thorough, and does not overstate what he finds. I told him what Harland had given me, and asked him to dig deeper into the 2019 Indiana case and the dissolved LLC. Wallace called me back 10 days later, the day before I drove to the Riverside Inn and found a text message telling me to sleep in the lobby. What he had found was this. The LLC, which had been called Meridian Property Development Group and had existed for approximately 14 months before dissolving, had, during those 14 months, collected investment deposits from 7 individuals for a mixed-use development project in suburban Columbus that had never broken ground, never obtained permits, and, as far as anyone could determine, had never been intended to break ground. The deposits ranged from $18,000 to $65,000. Total collected, approximately $312,000. The money had moved through the LLC's business account and then, in a series of transfers, into 2 personal accounts. One of those accounts was held by Preston under a variant spelling of his last name that did not match the name he used socially. The other account was held jointly by Preston and a woman named Felicia, who, according to her LinkedIn profile, was a licensed real estate agent in Franklin County and who had, according to Wallace's research, been in a documented personal relationship with Preston as recently as 22 months ago. Felicia had been a bridesmaid at my daughter's engagement party. I had shaken her hand, and she had told me what a wonderful man Preston was. I had sat with all of this for one night. Then I had packed my bag and driven to the Riverside Inn and been told to sleep in the lobby. Now I was sitting in the presidential suite of the Harrington Grand, eating a ribeye, looking at the river, and thinking about what to do next. I called Harland. It was late, but he picked up, because that's the kind of lawyer he is. I told him everything Wallace had found. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We need to file a police report, and you need to talk to your daughter before you do anything else. You give her the chance to hear this from you. One chance." I agreed with him. The next morning, I drove back to the Riverside Inn. It was early, before the breakfast events began, and I found Cassie in the small garden behind the property where she had gone to get away from whatever coordinating was happening inside. She was sitting on a bench in a light blue sweater, and she looked, for a moment, like she was 12 years old and the world hadn't complicated things yet. Then she saw my face and her expression shifted. "Dad, if this is about last night—" "It's not," I said. "Sit with me for a few minutes." I did not lead with accusations. I put the folder Harland had compiled on the bench between us, and I talked to her calmly and slowly. I told her about the LLC. I told her about the LLC. I told her about the investors. I told her about Felicia and the joint account and the money. I told her about the 2019 lawsuit in Indiana and the 2021 complaint in Kentucky. She didn't speak for a very long time. I watched her read through the documents. Her face went through several things: disbelief, then something that looked like she was searching for an alternate explanation, then a stillness that I recognized because I had seen it on her mother's face once, years ago, when her mother had received news she wasn't ready for. It was the stillness of a person deciding whether to stay in the version of events they've been living in or step out into a harder, colder truth. "He told me the Indiana thing was a misunderstanding," she said finally. Her voice was very quiet. "He said the other partner had mishandled the funds and it had nothing to do with him." "I know," I said. "Felicia is—" She stopped. "I know." She closed the folder. She put both her hands flat on top of it, like she was keeping it from blowing away in a wind that wasn't there. "I transferred my condo," she said. "I know. Harland says that can be addressed. It's not too late." She looked at me then, and her eyes were wet, and she said, "I told you to sleep in the lobby." "You did?" I said. "I'm so sorry, Dad." "I know that too." We sat there for a while. The morning was cold and clear, and a cardinal landed on the fence at the edge of the garden and sat there for a moment looking at us before flying off. What happened next unfolded over the following 72 hours in the orderly, methodical way that things unfold when you have a good attorney and a well-documented paper trail. Harland filed a police report with the Columbus Division of Police on behalf of 3 of the original 7 investors, who had been located by Wallace and who, once contacted, turned out to have been waiting a long time for someone to take this seriously. A detective was assigned to the case by the end of the week. Cassie did not go through with the wedding. She made that decision herself, sitting in the garden that morning before I said another word. She went inside, and she asked Preston to come speak with her privately, and I walked back to my car and drove to the Harrington Grand, and had breakfast by myself at the table I had reserved overlooking the river. I ate eggs Benedict, and drank 2 cups of coffee, and read the newspaper on my phone the way I did every Saturday morning at home. The dining room was warm, and the service was quiet and unhurried. Cassie called me at 10:15. "He's gone," she said. "I told him I knew. He tried to explain for about 20 minutes, and then he left." "How are you?" She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know yet." Relieved, I think, underneath the rest of it. She paused. "Where are you?" "Having breakfast at the Harrington Grand." "The big one on the river?" "That's the one." "Of course you are." And she laughed, briefly and shakily, which was the best sound I had heard in weeks. She came and met me for lunch. We sat at the same table, and she ordered the salmon, and I had the French onion soup, and we talked for 3 hours. Not about Preston, mostly. About her mother. About a road trip the 3 of us had taken when Cassie was 9. About the drafting table I'd kept in the garage until she was a teenager, and she used to do her homework on it because she liked the smell of the blueprints. She asked me why I hadn't pushed harder, earlier, when I first suspected something was wrong. I thought about that for a moment. "Because it wasn't my truth to deliver," I said. "I could gather it, I could protect you with it, but I couldn't make you ready to receive it before you were ready. All I could do was make sure that when the moment came, I had something solid to put in your hands." She nodded slowly. She looked out at the river for a while. "The condo," she said. "Harland is already working on it. The transfer was recent and the marriage never happened. He says the odds are good." I feel so stupid. You loved someone who studied how to be loved. That's not stupidity. That's just the cost of being open. She looked at me the way she used to look at me when she was small, and I had said something she was going to think about for a long time. The detective's investigation took several months. Two of the original investors gave formal statements. A third, an elderly man in Worthington who had put in $40,000 and spent 2 years believing it was simply a bad investment, cried on the phone with Wallace and said he hadn't told his wife because he was ashamed. He gave his statement too. Felicia cooperated with investigators in exchange for leniency consideration. Preston was indicted on 3 counts of wire fraud in the spring. His attorney entered a not guilty plea. The trial was scheduled. On the morning the indictment was announced, I drove to the cemetery where my wife is buried. It's a quiet place on the east side of Columbus with old oak trees that in spring are so green they look almost unreal. I sat with her for an hour and told her what had happened and what I'd done. I told her Cassie was all right, a little banged up, a little wiser, but all right. The thing about having spent 41 years looking at how structures hold and fail is that you understand something most people don't think about. The crack doesn't cause the collapse. The crack is the warning. The collapse comes from ignoring it, from deciding the structure looks fine from the outside, and that's good enough, from not wanting to know where the stress is concentrated, because knowing would require you to act. Preston had been a crack in the foundation of my daughter's life. I had seen it early. I had documented it quietly. I had waited until I had something solid enough to build on. And when the moment came, I had not been sleeping in any lobby. I had been 14 floors up, overlooking the river, with heated floors and room service and a legal pad full of notes that turned out to matter very much. I don't tell this story because I want to be seen as someone who handled things perfectly. I missed things. I moved slower than I should have in the middle when I was still hoping Cassie would ask me the right question on her own. There are conversations I wish I'd had differently. But I tell it because someone once asked me what I would have done if I had just driven home that night from the Riverside Inn parking lot, gone back to Columbus, left the situation alone. I thought about that for a long time. I think the crack would have spread, the way cracks do, quietly under pressure, until one day the weight of everything resting on the structure becomes too much and there's no warning, just the sound of something giving way all at once. The best thing I ever built was not a bridge. It was the kind of relationship with my daughter where, even after she told me to sleep in the lobby, she was still willing to sit with me in a cold garden and read what I had put in front of her. That took 40 years to build, and no one was going to cancel it. I've been thinking a lot lately about what it actually costs to do the right thing when no one is asking you to. When I stood in that parking lot outside the Riverside Inn reading Cassie's text, the easiest thing in the world would have been to drive home, to tell myself it wasn't my business anymore, that she was an adult, that I had tried, that whatever came next was hers to live through. I could have built a perfectly reasonable case for walking away. A lot of people would have. But I had spent 41 years in a profession that taught me one thing above everything else. You don't get to look the other way when you can see where the crack is, not if you care about what's standing on top of it. What Preston did had a logic to it, the way dishonest things always do. He hadn't walked into Cassie's life swinging. He had been patient, careful. He had learned what she needed and given her a version of it, just convincing enough, just long enough to get what he actually came for. That kind of deliberate practiced deception doesn't happen by accident. It requires a person to make a series of choices, each one a little further from decency than the last, until the original line is so far behind them they've stopped being able to see it. And that's the thing about moral erosion. It compounds quietly. The first small lie is the most expensive one, because it's the one that makes the next one possible. By the time Preston was moving investor money through a dissolved LLC into a joint account with a woman he'd never mentioned to my daughter, he had been practicing dishonesty for a long time. The outcome was not an accident, it was arithmetic. I didn't do what I did because I'm particularly brave or because I had some grand plan from the beginning. I did it because I couldn't stop seeing what I saw, and I had enough respect for my daughter to believe she deserved the truth, even when receiving it was going to hurt her badly. That's not a complicated idea, but it requires you to put someone else's long-term well-being ahead of your own short-term comfort, and most of the time that is harder than it sounds. The intelligence part, the research, the attorney, the investigator, the paper trail, none of that would have mattered without the willingness to use it. And the willingness came from something simpler than strategy. It came from having decided, a long time ago, that I was going to be the kind of person who shows up. Even when showing up is inconvenient. Even when the person you're showing up for told you to sleep in the lobby. Cassie asked me once, during those long hours at the lunch table at the Harrington Grand, whether I'd ever been tempted to just let it go. I told her the truth, yes. There was a week in the middle of all of it when I wondered if I was overreaching, if I was the difficult father-in-law I had always promised myself I wouldn't be, if maybe I had this wrong. That doubt was useful. It made me check my work twice. It made me go back to Wallace and Harland and ask harder questions before I said anything to anyone. Doubt, when you don't let it paralyze you, sharpens things. What I know now that I didn't fully understand then is that the three things that got us through this, knowing right from wrong and choosing it anyway, thinking carefully instead of reacting, and not quitting when it would have been much easier to, those aren't separate qualities. They reinforce each other. The integrity without the patience and the clear thinking would have been just stubbornness. The intelligence without the backbone to act on it would have been useless. And the persistence without the moral compass would have been something else entirely, closer to what Preston had, actually. Cassie is doing well now. The condo matter was resolved. She doesn't talk about Preston much, and when she does it's with the flat, quiet tone of someone who has finished grieving something and filed it away. She's going to be all right. On the drive home from Columbus after that last lunch, I thought about my wife, about what she would have said about all of it. I think she would have said very little. She would have just looked at me for a moment with that particular look she had, a little amused, a little relieved, and then she would have asked if I wanted coffee. I think about that look more than I probably should, but it keeps me honest.